If there was a build that I've played over the last few years that I would have to call old reliable, it'd most likely be Steel Champ. Now this build hasn't been absolutely peak meta and as powerful as possible throughout the entirety of its history, but I would say at the very worst this ability has always been viable, and at other times it's been one of the better builds that exist in the game. Now it's neither of those things at the moment, but it's in a very, very good spot right now compared to how it was maybe a few patches ago, and after playing it a few patches in a row, I think I finally got it where I like it. So this build is a little bit of a hybrid type build. Not in the classic way that you would expect, but the way that this build works is we use two separate abilities that we swap out as needed. Our main ability is going to be splitting steel. This is our clear ability, this is what we use most of the time, and this ability gives us pretty substantially good clear. It hits pretty much everything on the screen, and when we use Call of Steel to pull those shards out, it can do some pretty significant AoE. On the other hand, we do have a bossing ability that we can slot in if there's any super powerful mobs, or say we're doing like some uber bosses or high-end content, and that's going to be Lancing Steel. Lancing Steel takes every single one of those projectiles that we were shooting before and shoots them in a straight line. And if we scale the amount of projectiles, this build can get hitting 10, 20, 30, 40 times a second extremely easily due to our offhand, which is the Savior. This makes it so that we've got two extra boys that are jumping around using our main ability, and we can hit probably close to 100 times a second at full kilt. Now the reason that this is powerful is because this allows us to scale added damage extremely effectively since we are hitting so many times, and it also does allow us to scale on hit effects extremely well, mainly life gain on hit. So you can imagine that if you are hitting upwards of 100 times per second and you're recovering 10, 20, 30 life every time that you hit, you're probably healing for quite a lot. What this means is that for any bosses or such that can't one-shot you, it's very hard for them to kill you. Now, this build can't tank giant slams or anything like that, but with the gear that I've put into it, I have been able to relatively consistently hit wave 30 on Simulacrum. It's not completely deathless or anything like that. I've cleared all of the uber bosses, once again not deathless, this isn't a hardcore build, but it's taken care of most content in the game that I've thrown it at, and it's been a while since I've made a guide for this build, and there's been some pretty significant updates, so I figured I'd get you in on the loop. Boys, it is extremely hot in my apartment right now, and I am in the process of melting in the Florida heat, so to make me feel better, make sure that you give this video a like, subscribe to the YouTube channel, hit that notification bell to stay up to date with all the latest content. Without further ado, let's get into it. So before we get into any specifics, I do want to mention that there are going to be timestamps and chapters down below this video. There's a lot to go over, so if you want to jump to any particular section, make sure that you go check those out below. So before we begin, I do want to kind of set your expectations for what you're going to get out of this build, how much you're going to have to spend to get there, and the kind of content that you'll be able to do. This is one of those builds that I've just had a soft spot for a long time. It is by far not the most powerful build out there right now, but it can perform extremely well. I was able to do, I think, all content in the game. I was able to do wave 30 Simulacrum. I did kill each of the uber bosses, the uber bosses. That was not deathless. Neither of those things have been deathless, but I've been able to do them relatively consistently, as well as right now I do have all of the big scary nodes for maps, like I've got Wrath of the Cosmos as well as Eldritch Gaze, and I've done some expedition stuff, and I've done some like double effect invitations and such, and been able to clear most of it relatively comfortably. There are a few uber bosses which are kind of tough for this build, mainly going to be the Maven as well as the Searing Exarch. The Searing Exarch has the ball phase, which is relatively rough for this build. You could grab totems, or you could grab minions or something to help with that. And then the Maven has a lot of pools of degen on the ground, which are a little tough to deal with, but that's really the only two fights that I had any real trouble with myself. Uber Cirrus, Uber Cortex, the Eater of Worlds, Elder and Shaper, and the Uber Elder were not too bad, but the bullet hell phase is kind of a little bit of a pain sometimes, so just keep in mind, that is the content that I was able to do relatively comfortably. Now when it comes to spending money on this build, there are two distinct different versions. There's going to be a low life version, which does significant damage, close to the damage that I have with 150 Exalt invested into this character, but it is not as tanky, so do keep that in mind. You can spend 5 to 10 Exalts on that version of the build, do a ton of damage, clear some pretty good maps, clear most of the non-uber bosses as well as Feared and things like that relatively easily, but it's not super tanky. It can survive a lot of things, but it's not going to be as tanky as what you see here. And then there is the version that I'm playing, which is the armor evasion stack version. For the cheaper, keep that in mind with big quotations, cheaper version, for 20 to 30 Exalt, you can get most of the defensives here, but 70% of the damage. If you want to invest as much as I have, then you can get the damage numbers up. My recommendation is that you try this build out with the low life version, see if you like it, and if you enjoy it enough that you want to play it, if you like the playstyle and you just enjoy building the character, then you can move into the more expensive versions, but I think most people probably stop on 5 to 10 Exalt with the low life version. Another caveat of this build is that right now the gear for this character is extremely cheap because no one is really playing builds like this at the moment. So keep in mind that if a bunch of people start trying to play it, the price of the gear could skyrocket and there's nothing that I can do about that. I am like causing that problem, but it is what it is. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the basics of the build, how we scale damage, how we scale defensives, and all that good stuff. Starting out with damage, this is an Impale build, and I'm just gonna read directly from the wiki because this mechanic is strange to say the least, but it says when a hit applies Impale to a target, 10% of that hit's physical damage is recorded before any damage mitigation is implied. Impale then deals the recorded damage to that target each time it is hit after that. A hit from any source will cause Impale to deal damage. It does not have to come from the character who inflicted the Impale. So now that we know that, the way that this build works is that we scale maximum number of Impales through Master of Metal, as well as 2 additional ones through a Watcher's Eye, and we do gain added damage for each Impale on the enemy. So when we impale an enemy, it causes that reflected damage for the next 8 attacks that happen. On top of this, we do scale a pretty significant amount of added physical damage, since added physical damage is so good for Impale, and because we are hitting so frequently, added damage is also really solid, and because of all of that, we are using Paradoxica, which means that attacks with this weapon deal double damage. That means half of our attacks are dealing double damage, and double damage scales really well with added damage. Beyond that, we are scaling crit. It is a pretty easy crit scaling build. We get like 70, 80, 90% crit chance, like 400 to 500 multi, so that scales our damage quite effectively. And then in the higher end version of the build, we are using Perseverance, so we're getting 1% increased attack damage per 200 of the lowest of armor and evasion. We'll talk more about defensives later, but just kind of standing around, I've got like 45 to 50,000 evasion, and when I pop all of my flasks, I've got 65,000 and 84,000. I think I need to move around a flask or something like that, but I kind of change them around all the time. So that gives us a pretty significant amount of damage here. So all of those things combined give us a pretty high damaging character. Now, talking about defenses, the way that this build lives is that it just recovers health extremely quickly. We have a ton of life gain on hit since we are hitting so frequently. Any life gain on hit, if we have like 10 life gain on hit, we're hitting 100 times a second, which we can get up there with the Savior and such. We are getting 1,000 life per second just from that. So if you're able to get 20 or 30 life gain on hit, you're getting like 2,000 to 3,000 per second, and all of that healing adds up quite a bit. Beyond that, we have Leech, and then this is a armor and evasion stack build, so we've got a lot of physical damage reduction, a lot of chance to evade. I think with all of our flasks up, we do have 90. Yeah, so 90% physical damage reduction, 90% chance to evade. We do use Enduring Cry, as well as we have a couple ways to gain certain charges. We are blinding enemies with a passive that we've got here, or one of the masteries rather. Dual wielding mastery gives us chance to maim and chance to blind, means that we are at about 92% evasion. That means 1 out of every 12 to 13 attacks is hitting us. So, since we have pretty good resistances, we've got okay chaos resist, hard to get more than that, and we have all of these defensive layers. Whenever we do get hit, which isn't very often, we're not taking that much damage. Now, we do have full chance to suppress spell damage, however, you'll see that it is 85% here. This is actually 100% whenever we are hitting things. We do have courage here, which gives us 10% if we've hit an enemy recently, and then we've got hit and run, which is 6% if we've hit an enemy recently. So that adds up to 101. So spell suppression, evasion, armor, we've got pretty good recovery, and then on top of that, we do move extremely fast. When we've got everything going, we can move through maps pretty quickly. When we've got frenzy charges, as well as all of our other buffs and everything going, we can move around pretty quickly, so it makes it a little hard to kill us. On top of that, we do kill things from pretty far range when we're clearing. However, when we're doing single target, you kind of want to be up in their face. Now that is the very, very basic idea of the build. Going a little bit more in depth, let's talk about all of the skills that we use. Now, starting with our main ability, you'll notice that we do have 2 different main abilities. We've got Splitting Steel as well as Lancing Steel. Splitting Steel is going to be our clear ability, and the way that this works is that when we put it in and we use this ability, if I can get some charges here, you'll notice that as I attack, all of these shards go out in pretty much every direction. So as we move around and we do use our Call of Steel, we'll be impaling all of our enemies, and then as we use Call of Steel, it will pull those impales out, causing an explosion of damage, and it ends up with some pretty good clear. Now, one thing that's interesting about Call of Steel is that when you pull the impales out of the enemy and it deals reflected damage, that reflected damage, as far as I'm aware, happens before mitigation. So in things like the Simulacrum or things where enemies have a ton of damage mitigation, Call of Steel does some pretty good damage. You might have noticed in the footage of when we were doing the simulacrum that I would be hitting them, wouldn't do that much damage, and then I would Call of Steel and it would like one-shot a whole bunch of them. So Call of Steel and the Reflected Impales does ignore defenses as far as I'm aware, but I could be wrong on that. I'm not 100% certain. All I know is Call of Steel does a lot of damage whenever I'm in the simulacrum. Now, besides Splitting Steel, we do have Lancing Steel. This is going to be our single target ability. As long as we've got steel shards, you'll notice it shoots out a ton of projectiles. So if we spawn a bunch of these and we hit as many of them as we can and continuously shoot these, we'll shoot a ton of projectiles. On top of this, we do have the Savior clones, which are going to copy whatever attack we're currently using. These Savior clones jump all over the map. They will attack bosses, they'll attack enemies, they'll clear on their own, they'll do pretty much whatever they want. This is essentially doubling our damage. Any damage that we do, both of the clones do half of our damage each, so it's almost doubling. It depends on where they position themselves and a bunch of other stuff. But just think of the Savior as like a 2x damage multiplier. Now, going over some of our other abilities, we do use Molten Shell. We are stacking armor on both versions of this build. We stack evasion on the higher end version as well. Molten Shell ends up being pretty good. We've got the full effect of Molten Shell at pretty much all times. We've got Vol Molten Shell as well for an extra defensive layer. Vol Grace does boost us up to 95% evasion, which is 1 out of 20 attacks are hitting us, and it does make suppressed spell damage dealt to you unlucky. This is a very good defensive layer, and we have it up enough. We do use Enduring Cry to get both endurance charges on bosses as well as just to heal us up if we need to, and we're using an Ancestral Protector totem. Ancestral Protector is the only totem that works for this ability because we are not melee. Blood Rage is very powerful for this build. It provides us leech, it provides us attack speed, and it provides us a source of frenzy charges while clearing. We've got Leap Slam to move around because we've got a lot of attack speed, and Leap Slam's pretty good, although it does get us stuck in the wall a lot of the time. And for our last ability, we do have a Mark on Hit. This is currently Sniper's Mark. I do swap between the two different ones. We have Anomalous Poacher's Mark as well as our normal Sniper's Mark. Sniper's Mark does give us significantly more damage and significantly more clear, but on cases where you really need to survive, since we're hitting so frequently, Anomalous Poacher's Mark gives us that extra damage taken, but on top of that gives us 50 life when we hit with our attacks and 25 mana. It's like 60 to 70% of the same amount of damage, but a ton of recovery, which is really nice. And that's it for our major abilities. Beyond that, we have a bunch of auras. Going through the list, we do have Defiance Banner. In the low life version of the build, you're going to be running Dread Banner because Defiance Banner isn't as useful. We are also going to be using Pride. This is a very important aura for us, particularly because of the Watcher's Eye. We'll talk more about the Watcher's Eye in a little bit, but the longer that you are nearby an enemy with Pride, the more damage they're going to take. Very good for us because we can kind of stand up in bosses' faces for quite a while. We do use Determination. It is an armor stack build. Determination is very good. We've got Grace. We don't use this on the low life version. The low life version is going to use Petrified Blood, but for this version, we need to stack as much evasion as we can. Grace is really good for that. And then we do have 2 auras that are going to be on our life. In the low life version, our banner is also on our life, but for right now, we are using a little bit of our life to do these because we just simply can't get enough mana. We are using a level 1 Vitality. You do not have to use this. This is mainly for my Watcher's Eye. You could drop this if you don't have the Watcher's Eye. And then we're using Precision. You should level up Precision as much as you can to make sure that you have a 100% chance to hit enemies. So just level this up as you need, depending on how much accuracy you've got. That is going to be it for our abilities. Let's talk about gear. Now, the gear does vary a decent amount between the different builds. I'm mainly going to focus on the armor evasion stack version. However, I will talk a little bit about the low life version. I have most of my old gear here. There isn't a ton of changes gear-wise. One of the main ones is that you're going to be using Rislothas in the low life version simply because we're not stacking evasion, so Perseverance doesn't make sense. You can use an amulet, something like this. Keep in mind, Recombobulators are really, really good for making amulets like this. You just grab a bunch of amulets that have like good modifiers on them. We're talking like Pride Reservation, things like Global Crit Strike Multi, any resistances that you need. Recombobulate them together. Do keep in mind that if they aren't both Warlord bases, it has to choose both the base and the Pride mod to be able to get it, so do keep that in mind. They're really good for making this. I made this with a Recombobulator. It wasn't that hard, but I might have gotten lucky, who knows. But this amulet can be swapped out with Ashes of the Stars with a little bit of tinkering. I do that in one of the Path of Buildings that is below, so we'll talk more about that later in Path of Building. But there are a few key differences with the low life build. We are using Bloodthirst instead of either Maim or Greater Multiple Projectiles. We are using Dread Banner, and we are going to be using Petrified Blood. Petrified Blood makes it so that we have like Slayer Overleach, which gives us a ton of recovery, and it gives us instant recovery instead of us having to worry about, you know, reapplying those leeches afterwards. But those are the only real major differences. We do take one different ascendancy point, and that is going to be that we will be taking First to Strike, Last to Fall in the low life version. This makes it so that whenever we do use a life flask, because we're petrified blood, it will give us the adrenaline buff for 20 seconds, which means you're pretty much permanently on adrenaline. Adrenaline is giving you 100% increased damage, 25 attack, cast, and movement speed, and 10% physical damage reduction. Also does the bonus of removing all ailments whenever it procs. That's not too often. Now for the armor evasion stack version of the build, we are using inspirational. 30% increased effective auras is really powerful for a build that uses a bunch of auras. Makes it so that our banner doesn't cost anything, and then if you place your banner, you get some cool stuff. I almost never place my banner, but those are the main key differences. Now let's talk about the gear of the version that I am playing here. So I've tried out a bunch of different stuff. I've tried out a bunch of different possible escapes. I've tried out the like Forbidden Flesh, Forbidden Flame. I've tried out cluster jewels, not cluster jewels, normal jewels, not jewels, unique flasks, normal flasks, all kinds of different stuff. And the version that I have landed on uses 4 magic flasks. These are almost exclusively armor evasion. Then we've got the 1 crit flask here. I do swap out to amethyst flask on things like if maybe if we're on like the feared and Chayula is giving me a little bit of problems, if it's like rolled really bad, or if I'm on like a really dangerous wave of the simulacrum and it's got like a bunch of extra chaos damage and like penetrates chaos resist, then I'll swap into this one. I kind of move around the armor and evasion flasks depending on how much armor and evasion I have as I change my gear around and move it, but that's the main differences there. Now let's go over the major pieces of gear. The 2 most important items to this build are Paradoxica as well as the Savior. I said previously why Paradoxica is so powerful, but the main reason is going to be the mod that says attacks with this weapon deal double damage. Because we scale so much added damage to attacks, we double all of that added damage every single time that we hit with specifically Paradoxica. Keep in mind this is a dual wield build, so it does alternate between, so only half of the time are you getting that. Also, only half of the time are you getting that 25% chance to impale. You have to cap without that 25% chance to impale because of your offhand. Now, the Savior in particular is a very powerful item for this build, particularly because those reflections, as you saw it here, triggers level 20 reflection when equipped. The way that reflection works is that each of these reflections is going to deal half of your damage, and there are 2 of them. These mirages, as you will see in some of the clips, just jump around, use the same skill of whatever you crit with. So keep in mind that if you're like leap slamming around and you crit with leap slam, they're going to start leap slamming, but they get replaced when you crit with something else. These are extremely powerful, and one of the cool things about them is that they last 10 seconds and they do the same exact amount of damage that you do. So if you spawn them and then you need to go dodge some stuff from a boss or something, the reflections will just keep attacking the boss while you're going and avoiding stuff, so it's not really a big deal at all. You can kind of do damage with minions almost is what it feels like. So those are the 2 major pieces of the build. There are cheaper paradoxes that you can get, like think physical damage and like the Blood Rage version, as well as the one that doesn't have dexterity intelligence. This is the most expensive version of it, but the cheaper versions are like I think like anywhere from like 3 to 5 Exalt. This one's like 15. Of note, there's crafting information in the path of building. I've got pretty much everything that you need to be able to craft. I've got it all detailed in there. And also I crafted every single piece of gear that I'm using here that can be crafted. The furthest thing from a craft that I did was these gloves, because these are actually pretty easy to get. All that you need to do is you just need to find a good pair of gloves with the tier 1 chance to impale and any other tier 1 hunter modifier, hit it with a Maven orb and just win the 50-50. Just look for a pair of gloves that have like good stats that you need, and then just buy up a couple, hit them with Maven orbs until you get it, and you're done. There's not really much to craft there. So for the helmet, all that you need to do is grab a Lancing Steel base, hit it with chaos resistance essences until you get the mods that you're looking for. I particularly was looking for life and 1 fire resistance roll, but I managed to get intelligence as well, which is pretty nice. I crafted mana because I need lots of mana and I have a ton of auras and I can't run all of them without some mana. And then once you've got everything together, you can roll the implicits with the Searing Exarch and the Eater of Worlds. Of note, because I needed the exceptional level, like the 10% mana reservation efficiency, you kind of got to play around with efficiency a decent amount in this build. This is an upgraded mod. It wasn't insanely hard to get, but you just have to hit a 50-50. Now I will address the elephant in a room, and that is Ashes of the Stars. Ashes of the Stars is like 45 Exalt at the current time of recording this video. Yes, it's extremely expensive. It is the best amulet for this build. There's nothing that really beats it. I have said previously, you can believe me or not if you want to, a Pride reservation efficiency amulet with some other good stats is pretty decent and can cover for Ashes. It's not as good. It's not even close to as good. Ashes is a ton of damage. But if you don't want to spend like 45-50 Exalt on this amulet, just get one like this. This should be like an Exalt or two at most for you to craft yourself. Ashes is really good. It gives us a bunch of reservation efficiency. +1 to level of all skill gems isn't super important. It actually messes up a couple things for us. And then the quality to all skill gems is the main kicker here. Both of our major attacks scale extremely well off of quality. Things like Phantasmal Ancestral Protector has a ridiculous quality. It's like 48% increased effective Ancestor Totem buff. All of these alt quality gems just make Ashes of the Stars ridiculously powerful. It's the best amulet. I don't even know if like a mirror tier with every single perfect mod amulet would beat it. Ashes is just really good. And moving on to the chest piece. The chest piece isn't actually that hard to craft, surprisingly. The way that you would craft something like this is you would just try to find a chest piece that has chaos resistance and suppression on it. You can roll this yourself with chaos resistance essences once again until you got those 2 mods. If you could get a 3rd good suffix, meaning like fire resistance, that would be solid. Hit it with a suffixes cannot be changed, a veiled chaos orb, go for either elemental ailment avoidance or percentage life and mana. I needed the percentage life and mana for this build. Craft the other one, you're pretty much done. Put on the implicits. Determination effect is actually more damage for my build currently than pride effect is. I think unless you have maximum effective pride, but determination gives me more armor, so that's pretty good. Talking about the rings are actually easier than they might look. You just hit steel rings, eye level 84 with essences of contempt. That's going to give you the physical damage to attacks. You'll see the essence mod there, and then just go until you get the modifiers that you need. If you need a very particular modifier, you can try to get a fractured steel ring. These are super uncommon, so you might need to like recombobulate 2 of them together to be able to get the modifier you're looking for. I bought this one for like 50 chaos and I rolled it relatively easily. The reason I bought this one like this is because I needed to craft the -7 mana cost on it. So you just give it some attack equality, you hit it with the contempt essences until you get a ring that you need, make 2 of them, and if you hit some that you don't need, you can sell them for like a couple Exalt. They're actually pretty easy to craft. I already talked about the gloves. These are relatively straightforward to make. There is a more difficult version of the gloves that you can make in the PoB. Check the notes for that. Perseverance, just a good belt. You just buy it. It's extremely cheap. You can corrupt them if you want. Life percentage is a pretty good implicit. And then the boots. You probably want to try to get the spell suppression fractured on these boots. It will make your life significantly easier. You hit this with Essences of Loathing until you get chance to avoid elemental ailments, as well as a good resistance. You can use Harvest to change the resist to whatever you need. You're going to do suffixes can't be changed. Hit it with a Veiled Chaos Orb and take whatever of the big movement speed ones that you get. I ended up getting Onslaught on Kill. You could, if you wanted to, try to go for Tailwind versions of these, or just skip the spell suppression and find it elsewhere. If you wanted to try to make like Ellie Avoidance, Onslaught, Tailwind, whatever boots, you could do that. But that's a lot of work, and I didn't feel like doing it, and it makes it so it's a lot harder to get Avoid Elemental Ailments, because the implicit that you can get through the Eater of Worlds of 23% chance to avoid elemental ailments is really nice. And I mean, what, we're getting like 60% chance to avoid elemental ailments right now with just this pair of boots, and then we're getting 25 from our chest piece and like a little bit from these nodes here. If you didn't have these nodes, you could still just do like the veiled version of this, which is 35%, and then you'd pretty much get, between just these 2 items, pure ailment immunity. Kind of insane. That's it for the normal gear. We'll talk about the jewels here, because there are a lot of them. So we are going to have to address Forbidden Flesh, Forbidden Flame. There's a ton of different Forbidden Flesh, Forbidden Flames that are good for this build. Arena Challenger, after all of my testing, is the best one. There are going to be some people, particularly one of my mods, Yay, who is my brother in Steel Champ, who will tell you that Headsman is the best one and that I'm a loser for choosing Arena Challenger. I don't agree with him, but we can agree to disagree here. He loves Headsman. I love Arena Challenger. Arena Challenger makes you move really fast, attack really fast, and it feels really good. Headsman would give you 20% cult as well as some extra damage, would allow you to drop these nodes, but yeah, I like Arena Challenger. As for alternatives, in the Path of Building, there's a full list of them. For the lower cost version of the build, I went with Overwhelm. It's the crit node from Slayer. That one's pretty good. There's a ton of nodes that work really well for this. Check it out in the Path of Building. On to the next jewel, we are using a Massive Thread of Hope. I got lucky and got in early on the Massive Thread of Hope. These skyrocketed in price after they fixed Path of Building. I got mine for like 60 chaos. Now it's like 5 or 6 exalt. This is a super powerful Thread of Hope for this build. It's actually insane. So we get the suppression chance here, as well as armor and evasion. We get onslaught effect here, as well as chance to gain onslaught to kill and armor and evasion. We get forceful skewering, which is one of the big impale nodes. We also get the merciless skewering, which is the other big impale node. You can get other things of note. There's like an int node here if you need it. You can take Volpact if you're using the low life version of this build. Volpact can make you pretty tanky. You can also get things like hematophagy, and I think that's about it. Oh yeah, Gladiator's Perseverance, but it isn't actually that good for this build. This is a crazy Thread of Hope. Really, really powerful. Now, we are also using a Impossible Escape with Conduit. I think Conduit is a little slept on. This one's pretty solid. It can get you some good life, it can get you some good crit, it can get you some good evasion, as well as spell suppression. Overcharge is okay. It gives you a way to be able to obtain charges on a build that can't get charges, but the Conduit one is pretty good. I like it. Alternatively, if you don't have the Massive Thread of Hope and you don't have the Conduit one, you can use the Impaler and grab these nodes here if you need them. There is also the Rampart node that you can get, as well as the Bastion Breaker through Impaler. Impaler one's pretty good, but I like the Conduit. And then we do have Lord of Steel. Corrupted Blood Implicit is the best to get on this particular jewel. It's really important to use Lord of Steel. It makes the build feel substantially better. Call of Steel use speed, Call of Steel reflected damage, and get that Corrupted Blood Implicit. Last but definitely not least, we've got the Watcher's Eye. You don't need the Vitality one. You can get life gain on hit on rings, or you can simply use the Anomalous Poacher's Mark. Go for the Impale's last 2 additional hits. This is a ridiculous amount of damage. It's not that expensive for just the Pride one, but for Pride and Vitality, when I checked right now, it's probably 5 Exalt. It's going to go up when this video goes out. Do keep that in mind. And then we've got our Cluster Jewel. In the other version of the build, the low life version of the build, you are going to be using 2 mediums that have Eye to Eye and Repeater, just the best projectile damage ones that you can get. You are also going to be using a Feed the Fury, Fuel the Fight, and Martial Prowess large cluster, because you are constantly leeching, so the leech nodes are insane for the low life version of the build, because you can never not leech since you have overleech essentially. However, for this version of the build, we are going to be using one with Fuel the Fight, Hit and Run, and Martial Prowess. Fuel the Fight and Martial Prowess are used in the other version, but Hit and Run does give us some spell suppression, and it takes away that one node that doesn't do a ton for us. Of note, this is our source of mana leech. And that's going to be it for the gear. There was a lot to go over, but hopefully that is everything for the gear. So we are going to jump into the path of building so I can go into some specifics with the different versions of the build, what you can expect, all that kind of good stuff. So let's jump into that now. Okay, so as I said previously, there are 3 particular POBs that are going to be linked down in the description. There is a low life version that doesn't cost as much money, the evasion armor stack version that is kind of like 20-30 Exalt right now, and then the super expensive version, which is my version of my character. So we're going to start with the low life version. As you can see, if we look at the damage here, our damage is 12.7 million. It's never going to actually be that much because that is assuming we're just constantly shooting Lancing Steels with no downtime. Assume like 75-80% of that with proper actual play. But when we include the Savior and all of the extra damage, we're at 25 million. So this version can probably do anywhere from like 17 to 20 million if you play extremely well. It also does have some pretty good life leech on hit rate. This is going to be constant healing that you'll get pretty much every single second, but it doesn't have a ton of evasion. It's actually at 0 evasion because we're using iron reflexes. Decent defenses. It's got okay resistances, okay armor, but not really a lot of defensives beyond that. Does have the potential of getting spell suppression, but honestly, if you're playing this version of the build, you're just really going for damage. What you can expect with this version of the build is I was able to kill like the Feared and most of the in-game bosses. A couple other people were as well, if you're able to do those bosses anyways. This build isn't magically going to enable you to be able to do those kinds of things. This is kind of a build for people who enjoy it, because it does a good amount of damage. It doesn't really die instantly. You'll still die to slams and such, but you're not going to be able to, you know, like take a bunch of hits on this version of the build. This version is using the cheapest of the Paradoxicas, which is going to be attack speed, physical damage, blind, and blood rage. Does use the Savior. I've told you how to craft this helmet. This is a very, very simple chest piece. It's literally like life resistances, and you craft the void elemental elements on it and then put the implicits on. The gloves, as I said previously, pretty straightforward to craft. This is one of the items that you should invest in. It's one of the higher pieces of damage on all of the gear. These gloves alone are like 15% of our damage, I think. So yeah, the very important item. Boots, once again, not super hard to craft. This, you probably will want to use recombinators or just kind of give up on some of the other mods. Do as best as you can here. Told you how to craft the rest of this gear. Not too difficult here. As for the jewels, we're not using any of the super crazy jewels. We are simply going to be using a Impale's last 2 additional hit Pride, Watcher's Eye, and the mediums that I spoke about before, Eye to Eye and Repeater. We're not using the thread, we're not using the impossible escape, we're not using any of those crazy items. We're using a Forbidden Flame, Forbidden Flesh combo right now, which is a total of 60 chaos for both of them. That is going to be the Overwhelm node. It gives us a bunch of crit. Of note, because of this, the Diamond Flask might not be worthwhile depending on how much crit you've got. Right now it's bringing us to 95. You'll see why I say that in the next version of this PoB. But talking about the PoB in general, there's going to be notes in here that has a bunch of things answered for you. It also does have information on crafting all of the gear, as you can see here. In the skills section, I've just done the bare minimum of getting you all the different skills. You'll notice that there is going to be 2 skills here. You'll need to enable Splitting Steel and set it in the DPS to get the actual damage of that. We've got all of our abilities here. This will be a little bit different in the other versions of the PoB. As well as our items, I shouldn't have anything crazy ticked here. It's initial effect of pride, and all of this should be pretty consistent with what you're going to find when you're just running around maps. Jumping to the next version of the build, which is the Evasion Armor Stack version of this. This is going to be the 20 to 30 Exalt version that I was talking about before. You'll notice we have 15 million full DPS. This is including having the evasion chance and all of the armor, as well as the maxed out spell suppression. This version's got all of the defensives of my version. It's maybe like missing 5 or 6% of that. But it's got all of the effectiveness of the defenses of my version. When you pop all of your flasks on, you've got 65,000 evasion and armor, 90-90. You can get the blind if you want to. 19 million DPS with these 4 flasks on, which will be on most of the time. It uses the same exact Paradoxica. This is the cheap Paradoxica. It is using the Savior. It does use the higher end version of the chest piece. Most of the rest of the gear is the same. We've swapped over to Perseverance. We are going to be using the Conduit here. We're not using Thread of Hope here. We're still using the Overwhelm, Forbidden Flesh, Forbidden Flame. We're still just using the normal 2 Inflict Pride, Watcher's Eye. Not a lot of crazy additional gear here. You can use most of the gear that you had from the low life version, swap out a couple pieces to make it here, but it's going to be a little bit more money to get there. And then of course we do have the finalized version of the PoB, which is going to be my character. That is going to be the expensive version. This is the one that's dealing like 30 million DPS. That is without flasks on. With flasks on, it's like 40 million DPS. That is full damage. This is the one with ashes. This is one with all of the alt quality gems. Awaken Greater Multiple Projectiles, you can swap that out for MAME if you want. The difference in damage is like 2 million or something, or maybe 4 million full DPS. But Awaken Greater Multiple Projectiles is ridiculously expensive. I've spent way too much money on this build, but does a lot of damage, feels pretty good, feels pretty tanky. That is the super high-end version that has all of the gear that I showed you in game. Massive Thread of Hope, Conduit, we've got the Watcher's Eye with the life gain with Vitality. All that good stuff. We've got the Arena Challenger, Forbidden Flesh, Forbidden Flame. If you did want to level up a couple more times or move some more points around, what I would say that you'd probably do is you would go for Prismatic Skin if you're looking for defenses, and you would probably swap to the Max Resistance chest piece implicit. If you're going for damage, there's a couple things that you can do. If you wanted to eke out a tiny bit more damage here, some of the main things would be swapping this jewel here to an Unnatural Instinct and moving that Forbidden Flesh, Forbidden Flame to this jewel slot. You could also simply put in the points into Bastion Breaker with Physical Mastery. That would be quite a bit of damage. It's one of the better damage nodes that we have available to us. And those are probably what my suggestions are going to end at. There are some other ideas that have like floated around in my head. Oh, you can go Heartseeker as well with like the Critical Mastery, the Crit Strike multiplier against unique enemies. That's another option. Or you can take the reduced extra damage from crit strikes if you want to die less. Those are kind of the options that floated around in my head when it came to like the last couple of steps that I might do if I decided to level up more. And that is going to be it for the video. Now, I know there's a lot to go over. Remember to check out those timestamps and jump to any particular section that you might need help with. I tried to set up these videos with all of the information that you could need for anybody who's like trying to play this build on console. I don't know why you'd play it on console, but a lot of people enjoy a video format for explaining this. For people who want written format, the PoB's got all the information for you. And last but not least, you can always join my Discord, ask me questions, or get some help on one of the channels. Remember, it's not their job to help you. They're just nice people. So one of my favorite builds of all time. I finally got the time to get the PoBs together for it, get this video out there. I hope that at least a couple of you play this build. It's been a very, very fun build for me over the last however long it's been since they've introduced this ability, and hopefully some of you can enjoy it too. Now, remember, boys, if you enjoy this content, make sure to give this video a like, subscribe to the YouTube channel, hit that notification bell to stay up to date with all the latest videos, and stay safe out there in raid class. And I'll see you guys in the next video.